Okay, you rolling?
Yep, rolling.
All right. This is Shaw's interview. Take one. Mark.
Okay, who are you and what is your background?
Do I need to spell my name too? Or on
Yeah, that's for the interview folks mostly. I mean, just.
Oh,
you
okay,
can-
great.
Just for the record,
Yeah,
state
do
your
all
name
that,
and
yeah.
spell your name.
Okay.
For the editors.
Sure. I'm Shawn Achor. It's ShawnAchor.
What is your background?
What do I need to describe myself at all? Like say who I am? Like
Yeah, if you
Okay.
wanted, yeah. So the first two questions are what is your background,
Okay.
and what is positive psychology, and in particular, what is that?
And do you want me to say I'm Shawn Achor?
I'm Shawn Achor,
Okay, great.
and do a little background too.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm Shawn Achor. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of Happiness Advantage and Big Potential. I am a researcher in the field of positive psychology. Both of my parents were educators. My mom was a high school English teacher. My father was a neuroscientist that studied the brain, so I didn't fall very far from the tree. But I grew up in Waco, Texas, lived there for 18 years when I applied to Harvard on a dare, got in and went on a military scholarship there. And while I was there, I went to Harvard Divinity School after graduating and was studying Christian and Buddhist ethics, looking at how our belief systems change the way that we decide to act in the world. And that's when I got exposed to positive psychology. Some people in the psychology department said, we can measure things like happiness or optimism or hope. I said, no, you can't. Those are subjective experiences. But what they showed me very quickly was that things like pain or depression, those are subjective experiences, and yet we measure them all the time. And then we help people based upon those measurements. And what I realized was if you can measure the negative, why could we not measure the positive? And so that's what I've been doing for the rest of my career. For the past nearly 2 decades, I've traveled to 51 countries to share this research on positive psychology and to research what works best at companies and schools to raise not only levels of happiness, but to see how that impacts our success outcomes as well.
What is a happiness advantage?
So the happiness advantage was based upon my initial research back at Harvard. What we found was that as the brain became more positive than your genes and environment should have predicted, we find that every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for rises dramatically. Initially, we found that sales rise by 37% cross-industry as the brain becomes more positive than neutral. Then we found out your productivity rises dramatically. In fact, your brain is 31% more productive at positive as opposed to negative, neutral, or stressed. Then we found out it was raising everything. We found out that it was extending how long people lived. It decreased how acute their symptoms were. Everything we test for on the ACT and SAT standardized tests rises dramatically when the human brain is positive first. What we kept finding was that people became more compassionate, more altruistic. They were able to effect longer and longer change and sustain it when their brain was positive, optimistic, hopeful, and deeply connected to other people. So we summarize this in this concept called the happiness advantage, which is the brain at positive has this unique, almost unfair advantage over the brain at neutral or negative. That happiness is the greatest competitive advantage in the modern economy for a student and for someone out in the working world.
Why do educators relate so well to the happiness advantage principles?
I think embedded within the idea of education is the belief that people can change, become better. But I think a lot of society believes that we're just our genes and our environment. And no one at these schools gets to pick their parents, right? The genes are outside of their control. And as we saw so clearly during the pandemic, we actually saw that the environment seemed out of our control as well. Not only the macro environment, but the micro environment seemed out of our control. So if all we are is our genes and environment, then our only choice is to wait for the world or for a school district to change. What we really started to see within this research was a different picture emerge from the data. What we found is that genes and environment set the initial baseline, but that you could move dramatically from there by changing your mindset and behavior and sustaining it, making it routine. When that occurred, change was radically possible in the system. We could break the tyranny of genes and environment over the trajectory of what happens next to that person. So when that occurred, I think that tapped into exactly what educators like my mom were attempting to do with these students. She worked in some schools that were low-income areas that were struggling not just with how to teach, but they were dealing with inequality or discrimination or racism. And in the midst of those massive challenges, we found that as the brain became more positive, we found that the ability to overcome those challenges rose dramatically.
Tell us about the orange frog.
So the orange frog was a parable that I wrote based upon the happiness advantage research. It's about a frog named Spark, who is this green frog that lives on an island with these 4 different ponds, an island that gets hit by a storm every year. So every year the frogs on this island have to keep rebuilding their homes. He has this one orange spot, which he hates because it makes him different. And then over the course of this very short, less than 10-minute story, you start to hear that as Spark does these positive things on the island, that he becomes more orange, which makes him even more different. But then he starts to realize being orange is not only advantageous, it's actually contagious. So he goes around to the different ponds trying to get them to become orange as well before the storm comes. And as they start to become more orange and work together, they figure out that they should build their homes up in the trees. And so when they do this together, they don't have to keep rebuilding every year after the storm. So this parable became a metaphor for this 2 to 3 decades worth of research showing us that not only is being positive contagious and advantageous, but that we can quantify a ripple effect that happens in other people's lives as well. And the work that we've been doing now with the orange frog to take this parable and then to put this into a positive psychology intervention that we use as a training. In this, we start with a group of people. They all read the book, so they have a common language, a common text. And then very quickly we show them the research behind this simple parable to get past those mental barriers. Then they see what things that they could be doing at the individual level to be able to make those changes. But they also hear that they're not alone. So it's not one person living on an island trying to deal with storms all the time. They realize that they're in the midst of this with other people. That transforms what happens next. I've been doing this now for 2 decades, and I really thought that if I could come up with research that could prove that when the brain is more positive, you're 31% more productive. And that's the end of the story. I just tell you that, and then suddenly you become happier and become more productive. And what we realized was that information alone is not transformation. Transformation happens when you actually have a group of people that realize that they're not alone, that work together towards a goal. Small potential is what we can achieve alone. Big potential is what happens when you pursue happiness and success in an interconnected way, which is at the heart of what the Orange Frog Parable and the training are attempting to do. So at the end, we actually have them commit to changing an individual habit, and then they look at their work routines to see what of their work routines they could change to make more positive so that they're doing with one another instead of alone. Happiness is not an individual sport. And when we treat it like something that's an interconnected trait, we get all the incredible benefits we've been seeing from the 2 decades worth of research in positive psychology.
In the midst of today, what's the impact on educators and culture?
So one of the things I think is so important about this research, when I first started doing the Orange Frog training out at schools, my mom, who was a high school English teacher, said, just don't waste their time. I was like, thanks, Mom. Thanks for that vote of support. But what she meant by that was that she had heard all these flavors in the month, all these programs that had come in that were saying, hey, if you do this one thing, everything in your world would change. And it's usually based upon a charismatic leader or a very specific popular idea. What we wanted to do is to test to see if this actually worked. Not, here's one person's opinion, but here's what happens when we apply this in schools across the globe in difficult circumstances with low socioeconomics or high socioeconomics, in the midst of a global pandemic, when they're teaching virtually or when they're at home, when they're at home or when they're actually in a school building. In the midst of all of this, what we got to do is to research this, which is what I love. I'm a researcher. So what we found was that while the schools were dealing not only with the challenge of trying to raise their test scores, but they were also trying to deal with elevated rates of mental health problems, everything from depression to stress, to negativity, to burnout amongst teachers. So we started measuring all of those things. And we kept calibrating the positive psychology intervention over and over again, the Orange Frog training, to see what works best and what doesn't, so we could jettison things to find the purest way and path forward. What we found was incredible. We worked with the poorest school district in Iowa. We were working with Joel Pedersen there, the superintendent, who brought us in one of the very first times we got the Orange Frog into the schools. And what we got to do was to test this when we could only apply it to the educators. This was to the educators and to the administrators. We didn't even get to work with the students yet. And yet what we found was that the test scores of the students started improving dramatically as the levels of happiness and optimism rose amongst the staff. What we started to see is that the happiness advantage was spreading from an initial leader to the students that were there. But then you can have test scores rise. We saw ACT scores rise by 3.5 points. We saw the highest literacy score changes we'd seen in the entire state. We were seeing these massive changes that were occurring inside these schools. We went up to Schaumburg outside of Chicago, working there with Andy DeRoss, the superintendent there. And what we wanted to see was what happens when you apply this not just with the educators, but with the students as well. And not just the students, the parents and the guardians got involved as well, as we started creating parent universities based upon having the parents come up to the school to learn about these habits and then go home so that they could do it with their kids, so that they're having it at home, they're having it at school, and the teachers and the educators and the administrators are practicing it as well. You can have high test scores and still have a failing school. If the depression rates or the eating disorders or the anxiety rates are skyrocketing, which is what we oftentimes see at some of the higher end schools that we've been looking at in terms of their academic achievement. Schaumburg was at the 83rd academic percentile when we came in. We thought that there wasn't much movement that was possible. We would see a ceiling effect, especially because they got an influx of students. About a third of their students that were below the poverty line in the midst of this training. While we were doing this, we were measuring everything. And what we found was that instead of their academic scores dropping, as the school became more positive, and as they embedded this within their curriculum and into the lives of the educators, what we found was that their achievement scores rose to the top 5% in Illinois, and then now top 2% in the nation. But as I mentioned, you can have high test scores and still have a failing school if the depression rates are high. And what they found is in an inventory that they were already using for depression, that they've been using that we didn't change at all, depression rates dropped by nearly 30% over the 3 years of us doing this program, and continued on as they kept tracking for 5 years. We saw that disciplinary actions dropped nearly in half. Calls to 911 centers dropped nearly in half. We were seeing these massive changes that were occurring within the community, not only based upon their achievement scores, but also upon the mental well-being of the students. So as we look at social and emotional learning as a country, we're trying to make it, we've convinced so many people, rightly so, that if we can focus upon not just reading and math, that we can improve the long-term outcomes for these students. What we're starting to realize is you can't do that social emotional learning unless the educators feel socially and emotionally supported as well, which we're actually finding is one of the largest benefits of the Orange Frog training, is because, one, the teachers and the educators and administrators learn that they're not alone doing this, but also they're learning these very specific tools that we've used at schools across the globe now that not only raise someone's levels of happiness, but improve all these outcomes as well.
Introduce Big Potential and talk about what it is.
So in the first half of my career, I focused on the happiness advantage, which was that we can actually change your levels of happiness above your genetic threshold, which is amazing. Happiness is possible despite difficult genes or environment. That was amazing. And then we found out that as you became more positive, your business and educational outcomes improve. So I was like, that's it. This is what I'm going to talk about the rest of my life. And then I started working with the Orange Frog. And what I realized was that as someone was becoming more positive and more successful, what happened to the people that they were teaching with? What happened to the other people in the teacher's lounge or at a board meeting or when they go home to their families? What happens when somebody's more positive or more creative? What happens to the people in their ecosystem? So I started researching if we could quantify a ripple effect that person would have upon other people. As we were working with Orange Frog in Flint, Michigan, one of the things I found fascinating was we kept hearing these reports over and over again that while we were focusing upon the educators, that's all we had resources for, was to work with the educators around the Orange Frog to raise their levels of happiness so that they would stay for more than 2 years, to keep going on that teaching and keep some continuity. What we found was in those classrooms, as the teachers' levels of happiness rose, the teachers, students, parents, or guardians' well-being scores started improving. The students' test scores started improving. We weren't working with the students. What we were seeing was that if you impact positively a few people within an ecosystem, especially leaders and educators, we actually see a quantifiable ripple effect that occurs 2, 3, 4 degrees separate to people that they sometimes never even meet, which means that this research isn't just about how do I improve my life. It's as I'm improving my own levels of happiness and success, I'm actually changing the entire ecosystem as well. That research was based upon 2 major studies that became the cornerstones for all the work we've been doing with Orange Frog. One of them was 2 researchers in Virginia found that if you look at a hill you need to climb in front of you, if you look at that hill by yourself, your brain will show you a picture of a hill in your visual cortex, which is amazing. That's a miracle in and of itself, that we turn light waves into pictures like this, right? But what they found was that the picture your brain shows you in your visual cortex of that hill, when the participant is alone, looks 20 to 30% steeper than if you put another participant standing next to them that they're told is going to climb the hill with them. That should not be happening. I thought perception was objective. It's not. It's highly subjective. Things like fatigue, chronic pain, and whether or not you think you're alone or radically with other people dramatically transforms the geometry of the challenges we have within our life. So those hills in front of us start to collapse and expand. We saw that in physical boundaries with the work we've been doing with 6 battalions of Marines out at Camp Pendleton. But what we got fascinated by was it wasn't just the physical ones, it's the emotional ones as well. As a teacher is feeling high levels of fatigue in the midst of doing a virtual school, or as we were working with COVID units in the midst of the pandemic, working with hospital systems, we kept finding over and over again that the more people felt like they were alone trying to overcome this challenge, that they weren't getting support from an administration or from their teachers, or that their students weren't responding in the way that they wanted to. The more they felt alone, the more those hills rose, and the less likely they were to take action to solve those problems. What we found is that the more people feel radically connected to other people, it shrinks those hills by about 20 to 30%, which is why mentors are not only important for, at-risk students. Mentors are important for all of us at every level of the organization, which is why we've been finding the Orange Frog training so helpful, is because very quickly you realize you are not alone, that other people are dealing with this, but other people also want there to be a change and are making the behavioral changes to make that come about. The second study that I find fascinating was based on fireflies. Fireflies light up individually and randomly in the dark. They do that across the globe to attract a mate. Their cap on their success rate for reproduction per night is 3% per bug. So if anyone ever asks you that, it's 3%. But it turns out on opposite sides of the globe, 2 species figured out how to do it differently. They evolved to have these neurotransmitters that allow them to time their pulses to the millisecond so that they can all light up and all go dark at the same time. The entire community lights up and goes dark together. It's beautiful, but not a great idea, because we live in a survival of the fittest world, right? You have to be the fastest, smartest, brightest light shining. Otherwise, you'll never be successful, you'll never be rich, and then you can never be happy. Every part of that formula is broken, but that's what our society teaches us. We don't understand actually how systems work, and I'm starting to learn it more and more with the work we've been doing with the Orange Frog. 2 researchers at MIT found that when fireflies light up individually and randomly, their success rate of reproduction per night 3%. When they light up together as a community, the success rate goes from 3% to 82%, which is amazing, right? It wasn't like one bug was doing well with the system, by the way. The entire system was doing orders of magnitude better than we thought was possible. We thought their cap was 3%. The reason is we didn't understand how virtuous cycles work within ecosystems. As they lit up together, the light became brighter. So it attracted more potential mates and more of the fireflies coming to attract those mates. So as the pulses expand, it turns out it becomes contagious. Just like we saw with Spark on the island, it's exactly what we've been seeing with these schools across the country in rich areas and in poorer areas. What we're finding over and over again is that when we find a way of expanding power out, enhancing the ecosystem, and surrounding ourselves with positive people, we actually can create these virtuous cycles, and that small potential is what we achieve alone. Big potential is only possible when we start pursuing happiness and success in an interconnected way.
2 more questions. For superintendents and educators, what's your hope or aspiration?
If I were a superintendent or administrator looking at something like the Orange Frog training, I'd be skeptical. I'd be skeptical because there's so many programs that promise the world to you. What I would hope for more than anything is for them to look at the data. The data on this is extraordinary. I've been surprised over and over again in my career. I didn't think the things we would be seeing happen in the Orange Frog, the long-term sustainable impacts, were possible. In science, we normally care about what's happening very quickly, so you can get published, right? So we want to see if you do a habit for 21 days, what happens on day 22, and then we can publish that data. The research we've been doing at these schools has occurred for 3, 5, 7 years now. And what we've been interested in is that when you take a longer approach to this, it turns out that those things we make routine build upon one another, and you get this momentum that starts to build. And that momentum starts at initial spark. So what oftentimes we see happen is the superintendent or an administrator will come across positive psychology research either through the Happiness Advantage, or they've seen my TED Talk, or they'll hear me at an educational talk. And what I would hope is that they want to go deeper, not only about how they can increase levels of happiness or use a couple quotes of it during a meeting. If they really want to see how they can embed this, that they not only take a team through the Orange Frog training so that they can actually see this in action, but that they actually listen to the other superintendents that have gone through this program, who will tell you that this was not a flash in the pan type thing. It's not, it worked, everyone felt good about it, and then they stopped. This became embedded within the language they use in every single beginning of the year, in their hiring practices, in the way that they talked about their school and what they were teaching to the students. We even found at some of the schools, the students were taking the Orange Frog book and turning it into a play so that they could then act it out together. So they're now physically enacting what was happening in the Orange Frog, which is based upon positive psychology research. And then who comes to see the play but the parents and the grandparents? So suddenly, it's not just a few administrators or teachers trying to push against an entire community. What they're finding is that the community is on their side, understanding that they want their kid to be happy, they want their kid to be successful, and oftentimes we've been doing that in the backwards order. We've been thinking if we get the students successful, then they'll naturally be happier. But what we're finding is if you can raise the levels of optimism, gratitude, social connection, meaning and purpose for a student, their scores rise dramatically. So what I would say to the superintendents is to test it out themselves, to see how it works, and then to hold on to it and not pick up something else, embed it within the very fabric of who they are. And that's why we've seen so many of the superintendents we've worked with become superintendents of the entire year for their states, who now volunteer to just go talk to other schools to tell them how amazing the Orange Frog is, because they've seen how impactful it is in their lives, just like I have.
So, with the TED Talk phenomenon, why does this work resonate so deeply with people?
I think people naturally want to be happier. The problem is that we have all these mental barriers that get in the way. Oftentimes when we're invited to speak at schools and they hear that there's a happiness program, what we hear from the administrators is can you tell us some of the data? Because the parents are like, okay, we're working on happiness at home. Your job is to raise their test scores. That's why we pay you, or that's why we have these taxes. What I find fascinating about this is that this research was so helpful, not only because it tapped into what we care about. Like, if you knew that your job in education was going to make every student in that school miserable, and everyone in your community miserable, you miserable, and your family miserable, that it would dramatically lower levels of happiness for all those people, you would not do that job, right? You wouldn't do any job if you were going to do that unless you just needed the money so badly, right? Because the whole point of a job or money, deep down, if you think about it, is we really think that it could actually improve our lives or the lives of our families if we're working super hard, or at least other people, right? And what we're finding is that if we're not able to achieve those goals, then why are we doing the work we have? It loses meaning very quickly. So what we got interested in is, deep down, even though people don't realize that happiness is the main motivator behind the reason why they work, why they have relationships, why they care about what's going on in the news. But they also have to be convinced about why they have to care about happiness. And that's where this research came in. When I was working with the Harvard students initially, they weren't really interested in happiness. They wanted to know how they can increase their intelligence compared to their peers so that they can get that investment banker job or get into the PhD program that they wanted. We had to actually bring happiness through the back door. And by that I mean, we have to show them, we have to say, would you like better grades? Would you like your creativity to rise dramatically? Would you like your likelihood of getting a patent to rise? Would you like your likelihood of getting a long-term job to rise or income to increase? Well, the fastest way we've seen to do that is to raise your optimism, gratitude, social connection, meaning, and purpose. In fact, what we found at Harvard was the greatest predictor of happiness and success for a Harvard student was their social connection score, breadth, depth, and meaning in their positive social relationships. What we kept finding over and over again is that there were things that were precursors to the things we really cared about. That happiness was actually a means and an end, where we normally treat happiness just as an end. So the reason I think that this research resonated so much is that we could actually prove to people that if you change this mindset and do this small behavioral change, you will see a feedback loop where not only will your levels of happiness rise, but the other things you care about will rise as well. Your success rates, your grades, your creativity, your likability, how long you live, your productivity, your sales, all these facets of our life start to improve dramatically based upon happiness. So the reason why I think it's become so popular is because people want it, they see that it works, and when they try it in their lives, they're stunned by how much of an impact it has. They can't wait to tell somebody else about it as well.
Okay, the World Happiness Day shout out.
And what's the date for the world?
March 20th. There's also, you could make from because it's World Frog Day.
I will, yes. So, as many of you might know, March 20th this year is Frog Day, International Frog Day. This is crazy. I didn't know this at all. I wrote a book called The Orange Frog, and I had no idea that it's Frog Day. Now, March 20th is also International Happiness Day, which is amazing that they're on the same day. This is something we've been planning for millennia. This is the first time that these two things have corresponded, and it couldn't have happened at a better time. What we're really interested in is how do we actually show people that happiness is not only important across the globe, but maybe even an orange frog could be the way that gets us there.
Great.
That was awesome.
Okay.
That's so good. Thank you.
Sure.
How perfect is that the two come together?